Good evening, everyone, or good morning, good afternoon, whatever the case may be. Welcome to another hearing of The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. I think I queued up chapters 31 through 33. Let's get started now with chapter 31.
Thursday, February 5th, 2026, The Hiding Place.
From the studios of the Bible Broadcasting Network, we present Christian Classics, reading from a book that has influenced the lives of many people. Our narrator is Lynn Brooks.
Today we'll be reading chapter 31 from The Hiding Place. In between meals, we were kept standing at rigid attention on the soggy parade ground where we had spent the night. We were near one edge of the huge camp here, close enough to the outer wall to see the triple row of electric wires running along the top. 2 entire days we spent this way, stretching out again the second night, right where we stood. It did not rain again, but ground and blankets were still damp. Betsy began to cough. I took Nolly's blue sweater from my pillowcase, wrapped it around her, and gave her a few drops of the vitamin oil. But by mid-morning, she had agonizing intestinal cramps. Again and again throughout that second day, she had to ask the impatient woman monitor at the head of our row for permission to go to the ditch that served as sanitary facility. It was the third night, as we were getting ready to lie down again under the sky, when the order came to report to the processing center for new arrivals. A 10-minute march brought us to the building. We inched along a corridor into a huge reception room, and there, under the harsh ceiling lights, we saw a dismal sight. As each woman reached a desk where some officers sat, she had to lay her blanket, pillowcase, and whatever else she carried onto a growing pile of these things. A few desks further along, she had to strip off every scrap of clothes, throw them onto a second pile, and walk naked past the scrutiny of a dozen SS men into the shower room. Coming out of the shower, she wore only a thin prison dress and a pair of shoes. Nothing more. But Betsy needed that sweater. She needed the vitamins. Most of all, we needed our Bible. How could we live in this place without it? But how could I ever take it past so many watchful eyes without the overalls covering it? We were almost at the first desk. I fished desperately in my pillowcase, drew out the bottle of vitamins, and closed my fist around them. Reluctantly, we dropped the other things on the heap that was fast becoming a mountain. Dear God, I prayed, you have given us this precious book. You have kept it hidden through checkpoints and inspections. You have used it for so many. I felt Betsy stagger against me and looked at her in alarm. Her face was white, her lips pressed tight together. A guard was passing by. I begged him in German to show us the toilets. Without so much as a glance, he jerked his head in the direction of the shower room. Timidly, Betsy and I stepped out of line and walked to the door of the big, dank-smelling room with its row on row of overhead spigots. It was empty, waiting for the next batch of 50 naked and shivering women to be admitted. Please, I said to the SS man guarding the door. Where are the toilets? He did not look at me either. Use the drain holes, he snapped, and as we stepped inside, he slammed the door behind us. We stood alone in the room where, a few minutes later, we would return stripped even of the clothes on our backs. Here were the prison things we were to put on, piled just inside the door. From the front and back of each otherwise ordinary dress, a large X had been cut out and replaced with cloth of another color. And then we saw something else, stacked in the far corner, a pile of old wooden benches. They were slimy with mildew, crawling with cockroaches, but to me they seemed the furniture of heaven itself. The sweater! Take the sweater off, I hissed, fumbling with the string at my neck. Betsy handed it to me, and in an instant I had wrapped it around the Bible and the vitamin bottle and stuffed the precious bundle behind the benches. And so it was that when we were herded into that room 10 minutes later, we were not poor, but rich. Rich in this new evidence of the care of him who was God, even of Ravensbrück. We stood beneath the spigots as long as the flow of icy water lasted, feeling it soften our lice-eaten skin. Then we clustered, dripping wet, around the heap of prison dresses, holding them up, passing them about, looking for approximate fits. I found a loose, long-sleeved dress for Betsy that would cover the blue sweater when she would have a chance to put it on. I squirmed into another dress for myself, then reached behind the benches and shoved the little bundle quickly inside the neck. It made a bulge you could have seen across the groat mark. I flattened it out as best I could, pushing it down, tugging the sweater around my waist, but there was no real concealing it beneath the thin cotton dress. And all the while I had the incredible feeling that it didn't matter, that this was not my business but God's, that all I had to do was walk straight ahead. As we trooped back out through the shower room door, the SS men ran their hands over every prisoner, front, back, and sides. The women ahead of me were searched 3 times. Behind me, Betsy was searched. No hand touched me. At the exit door to the building was a second ordeal, a line of women guards examining each prisoner again. I slowed down as I reached them, but the officer in charge shoved me roughly by the shoulder. "Move along, you're holding up the line." And so, Betsy and I arrived at Barracks 8 in the small hours of that morning, bringing not only the Bible, but a new knowledge of the power of him whose story it was. There were 3 women already asleep in the bed assigned to us. They made room for us as best they could, but the mattress sloped and I kept sliding to the floor. At last, all 5 of us lay sideways across the bed and managed to get shoulders and elbows arranged. The blanket was a poor, threadbare affair compared with the ones we had given up, but at least the overcrowding produced its own warmth. Betsy had put on the blue sweater beneath her long-sleeved dress, and wedged now between me and the others, her shivering gradually subsided, and she was asleep. I lay awake a while longer, watching a searchlight sweep the rear wall in long, regular arcs, hearing the distant calls of soldiers patrolling the walls. Morning roll call at Ravensbrück came half an hour earlier than at Wood. By 4:30 a.m., we had to be standing outside in the black pre-dawn chill, standing at parade attention in blocks of 100 women, 10 wide, 10 deep. Sometimes after hours of this, we would gain the shelter of the barracks only to hear the whistle. "Everybody out! Fall in for roll call!" Barracks 8 was in the quarantine compound. Next to us, perhaps as a deliberate warning to newcomers, were located the punishment barracks. From there, all day long and often into the night, came the sounds of hell itself. They were not the sounds of anger or of any human emotion, but of a cruelty altogether detached. Blows landing in regular rhythm, screams keeping pace. We would stand in our 10-deep ranks with our hands trembling at our sides, longing to jam them against our ears to make the sound stop. The instant of dismissal, we would mob the door of Barracks 8, stepping on each other's heels in our eagerness to get inside, to shrink the world back to understandable proportions. It grew harder and harder. Even within these 4 walls, there was too much misery, too much seemingly pointless suffering. Every day, something else failed to make sense. Something else grew too heavy. "Will you carry this too, Lord Jesus?" But as the rest of the world grew stranger, one thing became increasingly clear. And that was the reason the 2 of us were here. Why others should suffer, we were not shown. As for us, from morning until lights out, whenever we were not in ranks for roll call, our Bible was the center of an ever-widening circle of help and hope. Like waves clustered around a blazing fire, we gathered about it, holding out our hearts to its warmth and light. The blacker the night around us grew, the brighter and truer and more beautiful burned the Word of God. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or sword? Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through Him that loved us. I would look about us as Betsy read, watching the light leap from face to face. More than conquerors. It was not a wish. It was a fact. We knew it. We experienced it minute by minute, poor, hated, hungry. We are more than conquerors. Not we shall be, we are. Life in Ravensbrück took place on two separate levels, mutually impossible. One, the observable, external life, grew every day more horrible. The other, the life we lived with God, grew daily better. Truth upon truth, glory upon glory. Sometimes I would slip the Bible from its little sack with hands that shook. So mysterious had it become to me. It was new. It had just been written. I marvel sometimes that the ink was dry. I had believed the Bible always, but reading it now had nothing to do with belief. It was simply a description of the way things were, of hell and heaven, of how men act and how God acts. I had read 1,000 times the story of Jesus' arrest, how soldiers had slapped him, laughed at him, flogged him. Now such happenings had faces and voices. Fridays, the recurrent humiliation of medical inspection. The hospital corridor in which we waited was unheated, and a fall chill had settled into the walls. Still, we were forbidden even to wrap ourselves in our own arms, but to maintain our erect, hands at sides position as we filed slowly past grinning guards. How there could have been any pleasure in the sight of these stick-thin legs and hunger-bloated stomachs, I cannot imagine. Surely there is no more wretched sight than the human body unloved and uncared for. Nor could I see the necessity for the complete undressing. When we finally reached the examining room, a doctor looked down each throat, another, a dentist presumably at our teeth, a third in between each finger, and that was all. We trooped again down the long, cold corridor and picked up our X-marked dresses at the door. But it was one of these mornings, while we were waiting, shivering in the corridor, that yet another page in the Bible leaped into life for me. He hung naked on the cross. I had not known. I had not thought. The paintings, the carved crucifixes, showed at the least a scrap of cloth, but this I suddenly knew was the respect and reverence of the artist. But, oh, at the time itself, on that other Friday morning, there had been no reverence. No more than I saw in the faces around us now. I leaned toward Betsy, ahead of me in line. Her shoulder blades stood out sharp and thin beneath her blue mottled skin. Betsy, they took his clothes too. Ahead of me, I heard a little gasp. Oh, Corey. And I never thanked him. Today, on Christian Classics, we have been reading from The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom with John and Elizabeth Sherrill, published by the Fleming H. Revell Company.
You've been listening to Christian Classics, narrated by Lynn Brooks. This has been a production of the Bible Broadcasting Network.
hiding place from Friday, February 6th, I believe, 2026.
From the studios of the Bible Broadcasting Network, we present Christian Classics, reading from a book that has influenced the lives of many people. Our narrator is Lynn Brooks.
Today we'll be reading chapter 32 from The Hiding Place. Every day the sun rose a little later. The bite took longer to leave the air. It will be better, everyone assured everyone else, when we move into permanent barracks. We'll have a blanket apiece, a bed of our own. Each of us painted into the picture her own greatest need. For me, it was a dispensary where Betsy could get medication for her cough. There'll be a nurse assigned to the barracks. I said it so often that I convinced myself. I was doling out a drop of the vitamin oil each morning on a piece of black bread, but how much longer could the small bottle last? Especially, I would tell her, if you keep sharing it around every time someone sneezes. The move to permanent quarters came the second week in October. We were marched 10 abreast along a wide cinder avenue and then into a narrower street of barracks. Several times the column halted while numbers were read out. Names were never used at Ravensbrück. At last, Betsy's and mine were called. Prisoner 66729, prisoner 66730. We stepped out of line with a dozen or so others and stared at the long gray front of Barracks 28. Half its windows seemed to have been broken and replaced with rags. A door in the center let us into a large room where 200 or more women bent over knitting needles. On tables between them were piles of woolen socks in army gray. On either side, doors opened into two still larger rooms, by far the largest dormitories we had yet seen. Betsy and I followed a prisoner guide through the door at the right. Because of the broken windows, the vast room was in semi-twilight. Our noses told us first that the place was filthy. Somewhere, plumbing had backed up. The bedding was soiled and rancid. Then, as our eyes adjusted to the gloom, we saw that there were no individual beds at all, but great square piers stacked 3 high and wedged side by side and end to end, with only an occasional narrow aisle slicing through. We followed our guide single file. The aisle was not wide enough for two, fighting back the claustrophobia of these platforms rising everywhere above us. The tremendous room was nearly empty of people. They must have been out on various work crews. At last, she pointed to a second tier in the center of a large block. To reach it, we had to stand on the bottom level, haul ourselves up, and then crawl across 3 other straw-covered platforms to reach the one that we would share with how many? The deck above us was too close to let us sit up. We lay back, struggling against the nausea that swept over us from the reeking straw. We could hear the women who had arrived with us finding their places. Suddenly, I sat up, striking my head on the cross slats above. Something had pinched my leg. Fleas! Betsy, the place is swarming with them. We scrambled across the intervening platforms, heads low to avoid another bump, dropped down to the aisle, and edged our way to a patch of light. Here, and here another one. Oh, Betsy, how can we live in such a place? Show us. Show us how. It was said so matter-of-factly, it took me a second to realize she was praying. More and more, the distinction between prayer and the rest of life seemed to be vanishing for Betsy. Corey, she said excitedly, he's given us the answer before we asked, as he always does. In the Bible this morning. Where was it? Read that part again. I glanced down the long, dim aisle to make sure no guard was in sight, then drew the Bible from its pouch. It was in 1 Thessalonians. We were on our third complete reading of the New Testament since leaving Scheveningen. In the feeble light, I turned the pages. Here it is. Comfort the frightened, help the weak, be patient with everyone. See that none of you repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to all. It seemed written expressly to Ravensbrück. Go on, that wasn't all. Oh, yes, to one another and to all. Rejoice always. Pray constantly. Give thanks in all circumstances. For this is the will of God in Christ Jesus. That's it, Corey. That's his answer. Give thanks in all circumstances. That's what we can do. We can start right now to thank God for every single thing about this new barracks. I stared at her, then around me at the dark, foul-aired room. Such as being assigned here together. I bit my lip. Oh, yes, Lord Jesus. Such is what you're holding in your hands. I looked down at the Bible. Yes. Thank you, dear Lord, that there was no inspection when we entered here. Thank you for all the women here in this room who will meet you in these pages. Yes, said Betsy. Thank you for the very crowding here. Since we're packed so close that many more will hear. Corey? Oh, all right. Thank you for the jammed, crammed, stuff-packed, suffocating crowds. Thank you for the fleas and for the fleas. Oh, this was too much. Betsy, there's no way even God can make me grateful for a flea. Give thanks in all circumstances. It doesn't say in pleasant circumstances. Fleas are part of this place where God has put us. And so we stood between piers of bunks and gave thanks for fleas. But this time, I was sure Betsy was wrong. They started arriving soon after 6 o'clock, the women of Barracks 28, tired, sweat-stained, and dirty from the long forced labor details. The building, we learned from one of our platform mates, had been designed to hold 400. There were now 1,400 quartered here, with more arriving weekly as concentration camps in Poland, France, Belgium, Austria, as well as Holland were evacuated toward the center of Germany. There were 9 of us sharing our particular square, designed for 4, and some grumbling as the others discovered they would have to make room for Betsy and me. 8 acrid and overflowing toilets served the entire room. To reach them, we had to crawl not only over our own bedmates, but over those on the other platforms between us and the closet aisle, always at the risk of adding too much weight to the already sagging slats and crashing down on the people beneath. It happened several times that first night. From somewhere in the room would come a splintering sound, a shriek, smothered cries. Even when the slats held, the least movement on the upper platform sent a shower of dust and straw over the sleepers below, followed by a volley of curses. In Barracks 8, most of us had been Dutch. Here, there was not even a common language, and among exhausted, ill-fed people, quarrels erupted constantly. There was one raging now, as the women sleeping nearest the windows slammed them shut against the cold. At once, scores of voices demanded that they be raised again. Brawls were starting all up and down that side of the room. We heard scuffling, slaps, sobs. In the dark, I felt Betsy's hands clasp mine. Lord Jesus, send your peace into this room. There has been too little praying here. The very walls know it, but where you come, Lord, the spirit of strife cannot exist. The change was gradual, but distinct. One by one, the angry sounds let up. I'll make you a deal. The voice spoke German with a strong Scandinavian accent. You can sleep in here where it's warmer, and I'll take your place by the window. And add your lice to my own? But there was a chuckle in the answer. No, thanks. I'll tell you what. The third voice had a French burr. We'll open them halfway. That way we'll be only half frozen, and you'll be only half smothered. A ripple of laughter widened around the room at this. I lay back on the sour straw and knew there was one more circumstance for which I could give thanks. Betsy had come to Barracks 28. Roll call came at 4:40 a.m. here as it had in quarantine. A whistle roused us at 4 when, without even shaking the straw from clothes and hair, the stampede began for the ration of bread and coffee in the center room. Lastcomers found none. The count was made in the wide avenue leading to the hospital. There we joined the occupants of other barracks, some 35,000 at that time, stretching out of sight in the pale glow of the street lamps, feet growing numb on the cold cinder ground. After roll call, work crews were called out. For weeks, Betsy and I were assigned to the Siemens factory. This huge complex of mills and railroad terminals was a mile and a half from the camp. The Siemens brigade, several thousand of us, marched out the iron gate beneath the charged wires into a world of trees and grass and horizons. The sun rose as we skirted the little lake. The gold of the late fall fields lifted our hearts. The work at Siemens, however, was sheer misery. Betsy and I had to push a heavy handcart to a railroad siding where we unloaded large metal plates from a boxcar and wheeled them to a receiving gate at the factory. The grueling workday lasted 11 hours. At least at noontime, we were given a boiled potato and some thin soup. Those who worked inside the camp had no midday meal. Returning to camp, we could barely lift our swollen and aching legs. The soldiers patrolling us bellowed and cursed, but we could only shuffle forward inches at a step. I noticed again how the local people turned their eyes another way. Back at the barracks, we formed yet another line. Oh, would there never be an end to columns and waits to receive our ladle of turnip soup in the center room? Then, as quickly as we could for the press of people, Betsy and I made our way to the rear of the dormitory room where we held our worship service. Around our own platform area, there was not enough light to read the Bible, but back here, a small light bulb cast a wan yellow circle on the wall, and here, an ever larger group of women gathered. They were services like no others these times in Barracks 28. A single meeting night might include a recital of the Magnificat in Latin by a group of Roman Catholics, a whispered hymn by some Lutherans, and a chant by Eastern Orthodox women. With each moment, the crowd around us would swell, packing the nearby platforms, hanging over the edges until the high structures groaned and swayed. At last, either Betsy or I would open the Bible. Because only the Hollanders could understand the Dutch text, we would translate aloud in German. And then we would hear the life-giving words passed back along the aisles in French, Polish, Russian, Czech, back into Dutch. They were little previews of heaven these evenings beneath the light bulb. I would think of Haarlem, each substantial church set behind its wrought iron fence and its barrier of doctrine. And I would know again that in darkness, God's truth shines most clear. Today on Christian Classics, we have been reading from The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom with John and Elizabeth Sherrill, published by the Fleming H. Revell Company.
You've been listening to Christian Classics, narrated by Lynn Brooks. This has been a production of the Bible Broadcasting Network.
Now from Monday, The Hiding Place, February 9th, 2026.
From the studios of the Bible Broadcasting Network, we present Christian Classics, reading from a book that has influenced the lives of many people. Our narrator is Lynn Brooks.
Today we'll be reading chapter 33 from The Hiding Place. At first, Betsy and I called our meetings with great timidity. But as night after night went by and no guard ever came near us, we grew bolder. So many now wanted to join us that we held a second service after evening roll call. There, on the Lagerstrasse, we were under rigid surveillance, guards in their warm wool capes marching constantly up and down. It was the same in the center room of the barracks, half a dozen guards or camp police always present. Yet, in a large dormitory room, there was almost no supervision at all. We did not understand it. Another strange thing was happening. The vitamin bottle was continuing to produce drops. It scarcely seemed possible, so small a bottle, so many doses a day. Now, in addition to Betsy, a dozen others on our pier were taking it. My instinct was always to hoard it. Betsy was growing so very weak. But the others were ill as well. It was hard to say no to eyes that burned with fever, hands that shook with chill. I tried to save it for the very weakest, but even these soon numbered 15, 20, 25. And still, every time I tilted the little bottle, a drop appeared at the tip of the glass stopper. It just couldn't be. I held it up to the light, trying to see how much was left, but the dark brown glass was too thick to see through. There was a woman in the Bible, Betsy said, whose oil jar was never empty. She turned to it in the Book of Kings, the story of the poor widow of Zarephath who gave Elijah a room in her house. The jar of meal wasted not, neither did the cruse of oil fail, according to the word of Jehovah which he spoke by Elijah. Well, but wonderful things happened all through the Bible. It was one thing to believe that such things were possible thousands of years ago. Another to have it happen now, to us, this very day. And yet it happened this day, and the next, until an awed little group of spectators stood around watching the drops fall onto the daily rations of bread. Many nights I lay awake in the shower of straw dust from the mattress above, trying to fathom the marvel of supply lavished upon us. Maybe, I whispered to Betsy, only a molecule or two really gets through that little pinhole, and then in the air it expands. I heard her soft laughter in the dark. Don't try too hard to explain it, Corey. Just accept it as a surprise from a father who loves you. And then one day, Mian pushed her way to us in the evening food line. Look what I've got for you. Mian was a pretty young Dutch woman we had met in Wood. She was assigned to the hospital and often managed to bring to Barracks 28 some stolen treasure from the staff room, a sheet of newspaper to stuff in a broken window, a slice of bread left untouched on a nurse's plate. Now we peered into the small cloth sack she carried. Vitamins, I cried, and then cast an apprehensive glance at a camp policeman nearby. Yeast compound, I whispered. Yes, she hissed back. There were several huge jars. I emptied each just the same amount. We gulped the thin turnip water, marveling at our sudden riches. Back at the bunk, I took the bottle from the straw. We'll finish the drops first, I decided. But that night, no matter how long I held it upside down or how hard I shook it, not another drop appeared. On the 1st of November, a coat was issued to each prisoner. Betsy's and mine were both of Russian make, probably once trimmed with fur. Threads showed where something had been torn from the collars and cuffs. Call-ups for the Siemens factory had ceased, and we speculated that it had been hit in one of the bombing raids that came within earshot almost nightly now. Betsy and I were put to work leveling some rough ground just inside the camp wall. This, too, was back-breaking labor. Sometimes, as I bent to lift a load, my heart cramped strangely. At night, spasms of pain gripped my legs. But the biggest problem was Betsy's strength. One morning after a hard night's rain, we arrived to find the ground sodden and heavy. Betsy had never been able to lift much. Today, her shovelfuls were microscopic, and she stumbled frequently as she walked to the low ground where we dumped the loads. A guard screamed at her. "Can't you go faster?" Why must they scream, I wondered, as I sank my shovel into the black muck. Why couldn't they speak like ordinary human beings? I straightened slowly, the sweat drying on my back. I was remembering where we had first heard this maniac sound. The Baye. A voice coming from the shell-shaped speaker, a scream lingering in the air even after Betsy had leaped to shut it off. "Droper! Lazy swine!" The guard snatched Betsy's shovel from her hands and ran from group to group of the digging crew, exhibiting the handful of dirt that was all Betsy had been able to lift. "Look what Madame Baroness is carrying. Surely she will overexert herself." The other guards and even some of the prisoners laughed. Encouraged, the guard threw herself into a parody of Betsy's faltering walk. A male guard was with our detail today, and in the presence of a man, the women guards were always animated. As the laughter grew, I felt a murderous anger rise. The guard was young and well-fed. Was it Betsy's fault that she was old and starving? But to my astonishment, Betsy, too, was laughing. "That's me, all right, but you'd better let me totter along with my little spoonful, or I'll have to stop altogether." The guard's plump cheeks went crimson. "I'll decide who's to stop," and snatching the leather crop from her belt, she slashed Betsy across the chest and neck. Without knowing I was doing it, I had seized my shovel and rushed at her. Betsy stepped in front of me before anyone had seen. "Corey," she pleaded, dragging my arm to my side. "Corey, keep working." She tugged the shovel from my hand and dug it into the mud. Contemptuously, the guard tossed Betsy's shovel toward us. I picked it up, still in a daze. A red stain appeared on Betsy's collar. A welt began to swell on her neck. Betsy saw where I was looking and laid a bird-thin hand over the whip mark. "Don't look at it, Corey. Look at Jesus only." She drew away her hand. It was sticky with blood. In mid-November, the rain started in earnest. Chill, drenching, day-long downpours that left beads of moisture even on the inside walls. The Lagerstrasse was never dry now. Even when the rain let up, deep puddles stood in the road. We were not allowed to step around them as the ranks were formed. Often we stood in water up to our ankles, and at night the barracks reeked with rotting shoe leather. Betsy's cough began to bring up blood. We went to sick call at the hospital, but the thermometer registered only 102 degrees, not enough to admit her to the wards. Alas, for my fantasies of a nurse in a dispensary in each barracks. This large, bare room in the hospital was where all the sick in the camp had to assemble, often standing outside in the rain for hours just to get through the door. I hated the dismal place, full of sick and suffering women. But we had to go back again and again, for Betsy's condition was growing worse. She was not repelled by the room as I was. To her, it was simply a setting in which to talk about Jesus, as indeed was every place else. Wherever she was, at work, in the food line, in the dormitory, Betsy spoke to those around her about his nearness and his yearning to come into their lives. As her body grew weaker, her faith seemed to grow bolder, and sick call was such an important place, Corey. Some of these people are at the threshold of heaven. At last one night, Betsy's fever registered over the required 104 degrees. There was another long wait until a nurse appeared to lead her and half a dozen others into the hospital proper. I stayed with them as far as the door to the ward, then made my way slowly back to the barracks. As usual, as I stood in the door of the dormitory. It reminded me most of an anthill. Some women were already asleep after the long workday, but most were stirring about, some waiting for a turn at the toilet, others picking lice off themselves and their neighbors. I twisted and squirmed through the crowded aisles to the rear, where the prayer service was just ending. Nights when Betsy and I reported to sick call, we left the Bible with Mrs. Wheelmaker, a saintly Roman Catholic woman from The Hague who could render the Dutch words in German, French, Latin, or Greek. Women crowded around me, asking after Betsy. How was she? How long would she have to stay? Lights out blew, and the scramble into the bunks began. I hoisted myself to the middle tier and crawled across those already in place. What a difference since Betsy had come to this room. Where before this had been the moment for scuffles and cursing, tonight the huge dormitory buzzed with, "Sorry, excuse me," and "No harm done." I found our section in the dark and squeezed into a spot in the middle. From the doorway, a searchlight swept the room, lingering on blocks where anything stirred. Someone's elbow dug into my back. Another woman's feet were 2 inches from my face. How was it possible, packed so close, to be so utterly and miserably alone? In the morning, a cold, wet mist hung over the Lagerstrasse. I was grateful that Betsy did not have to stand outside. All day the blanketing fog hung over Ravensbrück, an eerie day when sound was muffled and the sun never rose. I was on potato detail, one of a crew hauling baskets of potatoes to long trenches to be covered with dirt against the freezing weather ahead. I was glad of the hard physical work that drove some of the damp from my bones, and for the occasional bite of raw potato when guards were not watching. Next day, when the white pall still lay over the camp, my loneliness for Betsy became too much to bear. As soon as roll call was dismissed, I did a desperate thing. Meehan had told me a way to get into the hospital without passing the guard post inside the door. The latrine at the rear, she said, had a very large window, too warped to close tight. Since no visiting was permitted in the hospital, relatives of patients often took this way of getting inside. In the dense fog, it was easy to get to the window unseen. I hoisted myself through it, then clapped my hand to my nose against the stinging odor. A row of lidless, doorless toilets stretched along one wall in the pool of their overflow. I dashed for the door, then stopped, my flesh crawling. Against this opposite wall, a dozen naked corpses lay side by side on their backs. Some of the eyes were open and seemed to stare unblinkingly at the ceiling. I was standing there, lead-footed with horror, when 2 men pushed through the door carrying a sheet-wrapped bundle between them. They did not even glance at me, and I realized they took me for a patient. I ducked around them into the hall and stood for a moment, stomach knotting with the sight I had seen. After a while, I started aimlessly off to the left. The hospital was a maze of halls and doors. Already I was not sure of the way back to the latrine. What if the potato crew left before I got back? And then a corridor looked familiar. I hurried, almost running from door to door. At last, the ward where I had left Betsy. No hospital personnel was in sight. I walked eagerly down the aisles of cots, looking from face to face. Corey! Betsy was sitting up in a cot near the window. She looked stronger, eyes bright, a touch of color in her sunken cheeks. No nurse or doctor had seen her yet, she said, but the chance to lie still and stay indoors had already made a difference. Today on Christian Classics, we have been reading from The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom with John and Elizabeth Sherrill, published by the Fleming H. Revell Company.
You've been listening to Christian Classics, narrated by Lynn Brooks. This has been a production of the Bible Broadcasting Network.
And so we conclude The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom with John and Elizabeth Sherrill. It is a production of the Bible Broadcasting Network, also known as BBN. And you can reach them at bbnradio.org if you're going online, or by telephone, 1-800-888-7077. I'm your friend, Pastor Mark. Delighted that you've been with me today for this reading, and we'll try to post some more before long. You take care, and God bless you. You have a wonderful, blessed day. Goodbye.